Good afternoon. My name is Taya Graham, and welcome to The Real Baltimore. The repercussions of the election of Donald Trump are being felt across the country, from the U.S. response to the threat of global warming to ensuring employees receive a living wage. His cabinet appointments and barrage of tweets have staked out extreme positions on a myriad of issues. But how will some of these policies be felt in Baltimore? More specifically, how will the Trump administration handle the city's ongoing problem of unconstitutional police practices, which were outlined in a scathing Justice Department report released earlier this year? The questions have huge implications because efforts to reform the Baltimore Police Department locally have been met with obstacles and roadblocks. And with Trump's pick of ultra-conservative Senator Jeff Sessions, many fear that the entrenched problems with policing will continue. That includes the roughly 1,000 people killed by police this year alone, and the country's record-setting prison population of roughly 2 million. And since President-elect Trump has promised law and order, there are concerns his appointees will do little to curb the ongoing violation of people's rights by policing in Baltimore and beyond. To help me sort out what might happen and what can be done, I'm joined by 4 guests from The Real News who know quite a bit about the subject matter of police reform and federal interventions. Paul Jay is the senior editor of the Real News Network. Eddie Conaway is an executive producer and host of Rattling the Bars. Easy Jackson is a producer and host of The Whole Bushel. And Stephen Janis is a senior investigative reporter with Our Baltimore Bureau. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Now, Paul, I'd like to direct the first question to you. President-elect Donald Trump has essentially embraced stop and frisk, which is an unconstitutional practice. And Senator Jeff Sessions has said he's going to be a law and order attorney general. Do you think this change will embolden police to continue their unconstitutional practices?
Well, I think, first of all, let's ask the question, why did the DOJ do such a scathing report, as you mentioned in your opening, about the Baltimore police force? Now, this is the same Department of Justice that pursues the war on drugs. This is the same Department of Justice that's involved in mass incarceration. So why is one of the principal institutions under the Obama administration that's very involved in mass incarceration and such, why are they interested in a scathing report on the Baltimore Police Department? And because I think when you get these two different sections of kind of politics in Washington, one which wants to be called themselves liberals, and the other one wants to call themselves conservatives. Well, the liberals don't want things to go too far. They don't want to see a repeat of the uprisings that took place in 1968. They don't want to see more Freddie Gray type Baltimore uprisings or Ferguson. So they want to mitigate when police departments go too far. They want to rein back the worst of the abuse. They don't want to deal with the day-to-day violation of people's constitutional rights, because even though they say in their report it happens every day,
right.
But you look at the recommendations, they're not going to do anything about it. But they don't want to go so far that people get so enraged that it becomes uncontrollable for them. That's the liberal response. The conservative response, and Trump is taking that to the extreme with people like Sessions, is no, we don't have to do anything to mitigate. Right. We need to come back even harder. So at the Republican convention, they get Sheriff David Clark from Milwaukee County, and he's essentially calling the leaders of Black Lives Matter terrorists, right. And try to link them to police shootings. They want to tell the police department, no, all this stuff of holding you guys back, no, we want you being the hammer, because we don't want rebellion. And the way we deal with rebellion is you crush it. So I doubt we're not going to see DOJ reports like this, at least for the next 4 years. And it's better to have had that DOJ report than not, because even though the recommendations are weak, it's good that the criticism came out in the open. And the criticism was very, and it surprised me, it was so clear on this, that police violate constitutional rights and they break the law in the way they police in Baltimore. Well, we're not going to see that again. We're going to see more of that kind of violation of rights.
I see.
Well, you know.
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to add. I think the other part of this is that the federal government serves as a pressure release valve also, right. To pacify the communities. I think they have had these kind of consent decrees throughout history and all over the country. And there's been small kind of gains in communities, but basically the community has been pacified. has been rocked back to sleep to allow business as usual. Because there's only so much you can do when you're trying to police the population that's unemployed, that's marginalized, that's oppressed. There's only so much you can do to keep the law enforcement in check, because they have a big job that they have to do. And they can only do it by using really serious, strong measures against the population. The DOC, lets the population think that, well, okay, if they're out of hand, something's going to be done about it. Nothing really ever is done about it, in my opinion. But go ahead, Steve.
No, I was going to say, speaking to Paul's point and your point, what I thought was really interesting as someone who's covered Baltimore for years and covered policing, is that report was unbelievably scathing, but at the same time, not a single person was fired. Not a single person walked out of the police headquarters, as we said before, with their belongings in a box. There was no political reaction whatsoever. And remember, we asked the mayor, who's responsible? And the mayor said the system. So, right. I think it is a situation where, what Paul says is kind of correct. It's sort of a pacification. It's sort of a way of saying, look, we looked at this. But when you look for real change, you haven't seen much, and you don't see resources being allocated from the police department, put in education, or anything really specifically being addressed until, of course, we see the consent decree. But it is sort of seems to be papered at this point.
So does that mean we're better off without a consent decree? Because it seems like it's giving people false hope. And Senator Jeff Sessions said in 2008 that he thought consent decrees were undemocratic.
Well, let me just throw something in fast for people that aren't following the Baltimore story. Explain what the consent decree is. I'm interviewing you for a second here.
Okay,
some people may not know. Yeah.
Okay, well, right now Catherine Pugh has 9 out of the 21 points of the consent decree. Our new mayor has 9 out of 21 points laid down. And what a consent decree does is it's put in front of a federal judge, and it is the specificity of the recommendations in the Department of Justice report. And essentially the city is going to be held to account. There's going to be an independent monitor to make sure that Baltimore City Police Department complies with those points specifically. And that's what consent decree is.
Of course, we don't know what's in this consent decree at this point, because we asked the mayor, we've asked over and over again, and that would be the question. But we do know that the Justice Department analyzed, I thought was interesting, past consent decrees and saw very few substantive changes. One thing that was central was that of the 25 consent decrees, cost the community $600 million over the period of time to implement them, which of course we know Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake has asked for $30 million to implement this consent decree. We also asked our current mayor, Catherine Pugh, if she was going to ask for money to pay for it, and she said she didn't give us really specific, but you can see one thing that's true is these consent decrees are very costly.
Well, I think that's also been said that these consent decrees aren't very effective as well. I mean, I think the Washington Post did a survey of consent decrees, and the results were mixed at best.
And towards Stephen's point, it's more money for training, it's more money for instructors, it's more money to spruce up the paperwork for the law enforcement agents, and so they get a bigger part of the budget. And the people that's actually impacted, their lives don't change. I mean, the thing on 95, say for instance, that for the state police stopping drivers coming up and down 95. So I mean, the solution was, well, keep a record of who you stop. And that doesn't change anything. People are still being stopped and put on the side of the highways, So all these decrees are paperwork. I'm not saying we don't need them, but unless there's some enforcement behind them.
I mean, it's another pacifier, I think. I think it's important to have something that we can hold the police accountable to, that we as the people can always, go back and check and, make sure, if we do, make sure that they're holding their end of the bargain. But it's just another pacifier to a system that I think needs to be changed. The whole thing needs to be just restructured, and that's not going to happen. So consent decree, I think in a way it's good. Like I said, it's a checkpoint, but I don't see it really making any effective change until, like you're saying, get rid of the whole crew that's in there now, fire everybody, and start over. I think that's the only logical way to really see some real change, because you got an officer that's been on a force 15 20 years doing the same thing, a consent decree is not going to stop him from continuing to do what he's been
That's a
doing
good
his whole
point.
career.
I thought the police union made a good point about something. When Freddie Gray was killed, and then the police union immediately jumped to defend the officers involved without even knowing what the evidence was.
Right.
At first, I reacted against the union's role, but I came to know better what their point was, at least some of them, which was that it's the command, it's the people running the police department that are giving orders, telling police to do unconstitutional, to violate people's constitutional rights, to break federal law. And I thought, that's why I say there's kind of two parts to this DOJ report in Baltimore. The critique is actually very good. I was surprised it's as good as it was. I was expecting just more talk about training, and they really went after stuff in the description of the problem.
Right.
One of the stories they tell near the end of the report, a woman officer is ordered to go clear a corner, be part of several officers clear a corner. And that is a euphemism for you go pick people up and you arrest them for nothing and you bring them back to the station. It's not about telling people to move on. It's about arresting people without probable cause.
Right.
And she refuses to do it, according to this in the DOJ report. Well, she's punished for that. She loses overtime. And this is all documented in the DOJ report. And she goes and complains to the supervisor of the guy who docked her, wouldn't give her the overtime. And he says, well, it's actually quoted in there. It says, well, you deserved it because you didn't make your stats this month. Well, we know what that means. You didn't arrest enough people. Right. No one cares for what. I mean, that's part of the problem with Baltimore. It's not about are you lowering crime in some way. It's just are you arresting enough people. So the report's description of the problem, we keep using the word scathing when we talk about it because it was really good. But what it didn't say, that it's clearly implied, it doesn't come out and say, if you're violating people's constitutional rights, you the police, if you're breaking federal law, that means you're committing crimes. It means you, the Baltimore police, are criminals.
Right.
There's nothing in that report that then says, arrest these people. Right. Now, it's not just about training and more data collection. Arrest these people if they're violating law. Charge them with forcible confinement, which Mosby originally charged these Freddie Gray cops and then drops. But the fact that it took place was a good thing. I mean, yes, it's to pacify. Still, it was a good thing to get it documented, just how bad things are. But the recommendations are just like same old.
But then what? Okay, so you document it. People look at it, they read it, they say, "Oh, this is really bad," and it's business as usual, and nothing changed. I'm not sure how does that help people in the communities that's being constantly having their rights violated.
Only if people get organized. The solutions are not going to come from the elites. Mm-hmm. Right. There's no question about that. And the fundamental problem is the reason there's a police culture like that is because people that own stuff want to hold on to it. Mm-hmm. And people make money out of chronic poverty. Mm-hmm. And so the solutions are not going to come from the DOJ, or the solutions aren't going to come from any of these things. But I think it's actually good for the people's movement, you could say, to be able to say, look, even the DOJ says you guys are criminals, and now we're going to demand accountability. And then you get into another conversation about how people get organized. I'm in no way suggesting because they describe the problem well, it's a solution. In fact, I agree with you, because when you go to what their recommendations are, more training, more data collection, like they could have at least said, because it comes right out of their own description of the problem, they could have at least said, commanders who give people orders to break law, those commanders should be arrested. That would have been nice, but they don't say that.
So I understand that you want command level officers to be held accountable for the instructions they give to patrol officers. So the question is, what should this consent decree actually look like?
I think it should look like some kind of attempt to bring police and community relationships together in a way that it should represent the people, and what they want. Right now, like Paul was just talking about the culture, and police officers being told to arrest people who aren't committing crime is not helping to lower the murder rate or carjackings or break-ins, anything. It's not helping because people, and specifically in a city like Baltimore, people don't want to cooperate with the police. They don't want to help because if I help you with this case now and then next week you'll lock me up for standing out in front of a corner store. You're not my friend. You're not here to protect me.
Right.
You know, so I think it needs to represent, you know, this strong desire from the people. And right now we're getting a lot of political games being played with it. You know, well, we can't ask for this and we can't put this in there, we can't do that. Everybody, you know, people in power are going out of their way to protect the police when in all actuality it's the community that needs protection, not just from, you know, not just from the criminals in their area, but also from the police.
Right.
I think there should be a continuum of the transparency, and I know transparency is sort of a feeble word, but the continuum of revelations. Because I was thinking yesterday we were reviewing statements of probable cause left over from the zero tolerance era, where they were arresting people for literally nothing, you know, like drinking a beer
or expectorating on the ground.
And they were continually writing up these statements of probable cause, right, that were completely illegal. You could just read them and you could see they were illegal, and they were cut and pasting and misspellings.
Right.
And let's say the Department of Justice continues to audit the statement of probable causes of police officers, and they continue to be published in some way, or some way continue to do a quarterly report. I think that would be really, really powerful, because that's kind of what they did. Because what they did is they revealed this the story that Paul recounted is extremely powerful because it shows a mechanism. And if they could continue to do that and have some sort of mechanism where the community, they are truly accountable community, not to the politicians that Paul mentions who really drive all this, which is what is driven in Baltimore, right? The homicide rate is a number that's politically quite important. So they take these policies and they order the commanders to do what you were talking about. So I think if they could have a mechanism for transparency to continue to reveal the kind of stories, I think you'd see some change.
I agree with Stephen, because right now the way it's set up, there's nothing. If you get arrested, there's nothing in place that stops a police officer from writing the report however he wants to write it. There's nothing. You can sit in your cell and look at your papers and go, wow, this is all wrong, and there's nobody there to fact check it or to help, you know what I mean, to make sure that people aren't unjustly being arrested and having charges put on them, which happens a lot in the city. You know, you can't solve a case, you arrest somebody, you throw that charge on them. Who's going to stop them?
Right.
You know, one other thing is I agree that the transparency needs to be continued, and it's good that those crimes have been documented, but there needs to be a penalty phase in this thing. Somebody needs to be held accountable when they violate those things, including people's constitutional rights. That's got to be in there. If that's not in there, it's just smoke and mirrors.
And you think about it, any other company, any other organization, any other group, to have these kind of findings in this DOJ report come up, everybody's gone. Everybody's fired. It's not even a question.
Absolutely.
Everybody is let go. The police department is the only department that gets these special privileges and this kind of like right in front of our face, just blatant disregard for the people and the community.
That's such a good point.
I think a couple of things. The consent decree should have called for community control of the police. I don't have illusions that the DOJ would do that, but if you're asking what would be effective, and real community control of the police, as we've been saying on the Real News, means the power to hire and fire the police chief, the power to actually hire and fire individual policemen, the power to recommend criminal charges to the Attorney General, State's Attorney. It has to have real power, and how you create that is a matter of discussion and debate. You know, is it elected? How does the community want to exercise that control? It's really the community needs to be asked and worked out. But to play on Eddie's point, to be effective, they're committing crimes, they should be charged, and we know the existing political structure, the city council, the mayor, and from within the police department, they're not going to go there. So there needs to be a civilian body that can, at the very least, hire and fire and recommend criminal charges. And the second thing I think the consent decree should have, going back to this woman cop that gets disciplined is some kind of whistleblower. Cops, there are some cops that don't want to do this stuff,
Right.
and they're afraid of repercussions. Anywhere from a dead bird on their car to somebody not showing up as backup in a dangerous situation.
Right.
If somebody blows the whistle, the community needs to embrace that person and defend them, and there should be something in that consent decree that protects them and allows them to come forward.
Now, I've heard people say, I don't care if my civil rights are violated, I don't care if your civil rights are violated, as long as my community doesn't have crime in it, as long as my family isn't a victim of crime or violence. Do you think there is any situation where unconstitutional policing is considered justified?
Well, I mean, you reveal sort of the complexity of this problem, because many of the people you talk to in the community as a reporter are more concerned about crime in their neighborhoods, or more concerned about people breaking into their cars or stealing from them. And sort of that fear fuels a lot of the problems that you talk about, because we do put policing in a special sort of, I guess, social place because of it. Because so much of it and so much of the rhetoric around it is defined by fear. And thus fear becomes sort of a currency for policing. And I do think Baltimore, when they elected Martin O'Malley in 1999 on the basis of doing zero tolerance, acceded to that fear. So as Paul said, it has to be a certain level of political consciousness to be able to overcome that, to be able to change that discussion and say, well, we're not going to solve it by being more fearsome or more vengeful than the crime itself that's occurring. But I think it's a really good point that has to be considered, because many people will allow police to go to extreme lengths just to feel like they're suddenly safe.
Yeah, but you know what? That's rhetoric more so than it's a reality, because as soon as the police violate their civil rights, throw them down on the ground, or accost their son or daughter, that whole attitude changes. So it's easy to say when you're talking about we don't care what you do to people, but when you start impacting you, it's like, wait a minute, y'all can't do that to Johnny.
Well, that's the converse of your whole thing. It's true.
Right.
I mean, and that's why Baltimore has been stuck in this situation, because people don't understand until it affects them, how the implications of allowing an institution as powerful as the police department to operate with impunity. That is what happens, but that's why fear is such a great way to motivate. But that's what Martin O'Malley used, was fear, right? I'm going to reduce the homicide rate, but all he was doing was sort of playing on people's fears, and then suddenly 100,000 people were arrested. So you're absolutely right.
People are suffering twice. One, people are suffering from unemployment, low wages, the poverty, and then people living in these areas are the ones that suffer the consequences of traumatized kids that grow up to commit violent crimes. People that have, because they have no jobs, get involved in the only thing there is, which is the drug business, which is inherently violent. And then you suffer twice. You live in these deprived conditions, and then because of the crime it comes and gets you. So it's a problem, because you have a right, one, to say, I don't want these economic, social conditions anymore, but two, I have a right to have some safety. I should be able to walk to the corner store and not get mugged. But I don't want policing that's abusive, that's racist, and treats us like animals. So there is a legitimate short-term demand of people that you need some policing. You can't have mayhem outside your door.
Right.
But that policing can't be bloody abusive. And you damn well better deal with the conditions that are creating this crime in the first place, which is the poverty and the low wages.
Well, I think you get to the crux of the matter there, which is that there are issues and social ills like poverty and homelessness and drug addiction and lead poisoning and mental health issues. And a lot of times police officers are the front line. Do you think there's any way that there can be effective policing when we have such intractable problems in Baltimore City?
I think, and I was talking to some friends about this over the weekend. A friend was describing a situation to me where a police officer was clearly stressed out from something previous that had happened. I think one of the effective ways, and we don't hear this talked about a lot, is I don't think there's enough therapy and work being done with our police officers and their mental health. To have to work in some of these conditions, we forget that they are also people. And so without that proper therapy, without the proper time off, what I mean, to spend with your family and, and come back and regroup, you are violating people's rights automatically. Why? Because you're working under a system that's going to protect you to do so, and so you might not in your heart want to beat this kid up on the street in front of everybody, but because of everything else you've been under, everything else you've dealt with that week. You know, you end up lashing out doing it because you're a human being. I remember calling a police officer to my house to fill out a report about a car accident. And in the discussion, he was not being very helpful. And when I expressed frustration about him not being helpful, he reached for his gun. But on that day, in West Baltimore, there had already been several shootings. You know what I mean? It was a crazy day in West Baltimore. The weather had just broke, and I said to him, I said, you know, I can see that you're dealing with a lot. I'm just gonna call another officer. And he like calmed down, and like 2 weeks later came and apologized to me. Wow. But it was at that moment that I realized, yo, these are also people that are working under really, really crazy,
really stressful
situations.
conditions.
And I think we can have effective policing. I think that's one of the ways that can help. If we really put a focus on what is the mental health of these police officers. Are you really just sending anybody, paying them $30,000 a year to patrol a neighborhood, you know, and not making sure that they're properly equipped to do so? And that's what's happening.
You know, I want to chime in on that though, because what we have internationally, when there's a war somewhere, soldiers go in country. They're only allowed to stay so long in a combat zone.
They have a limited tour.
Because anything over a year or 2 years is detrimental. And even if you're the nicest person in the world, under that stress of constant combat, you change.
Right.
Out of fear of your partner being lost, you being lost, and so on. That same situation applies to police in some communities. And the way those communities police is in a combat manner. And it creates that same stress.
Right.
And so no amount of health care or mental illness training or therapy or anything else. No, there's got to be shorter spans of that interaction. There's got to be more rotation and replacement, and it's a lot of other things. But you can't leave a soldier in combat for 2 years and don't expect him to go off at some point.
That's a really good point.
I think we got to change the mission of the police force. We live in a class society. Nobody wants to say it. In all these elections, there's a middle class. But there's never, other than Bernie Sanders, who talked about a billionaire class, nobody ever talks about elites. The mission of this police force is to defend private property. It's really serious, obvious, I should say. And the more private property you got, the more you get defended. The mission of the Baltimore Police Force is contain crime. That's the consequence of poverty in poor neighborhoods. Don't let it spill out into the Roland Parks and the wealthy areas.
Wait, Paul, I've got to challenge you on this, because you're saying it's about class, but Vanita Gupta of the Department of Justice, she said it was about race. As a matter of fact, one of the first things she said was that the unconstitutional practices are unconstitutional because it's based on race. That's what it's about, race. People are arresting black people unjustly in Baltimore.
Yeah, but you can't, you're starting a whole other show here. Racism is one of the ideologies that defends private property and capitalism. And you have to dehumanize people you exploit. And the more you want to exploit them, the more you dehumanize
but there's poor white people in Hamden, poor white people in Remington, and they are not being arrested in the same ways.
I can take you to cities where there's almost no people of color. I can take you to Toronto, where I'm from. And the areas of poor white are getting not as abusive as Baltimore, but far more abused poor whites than rich whites. There's no comparison. Of course, racism is pervasive here. There's no disconnect between class and race. Racism is how the wealthy whites and, in a way, even wealthy blacks, and there's certainly a whole black political class,
very true,
you know, who look at poor people in general, and even more poor people of color, as subhuman. So it's okay you pay them $7.25 an hour. You know, it's okay that, you know, the mayhem that goes on in poor neighborhoods, and one shouldn't exaggerate that too much, because most people living in poor neighborhoods go to work every morning, you know, and they're the ones suffering the consequences of this. But what I'm saying is, by changing the mission of the police force, you have to say that the police force are there to make neighborhoods livable, and to prevent this sort of the consequences of these bad social conditions, unlivable social conditions. They have to be dealt with in some way that people can live their life. And then you also have to deal with the unlivable social conditions. It comes down to who has political power. It comes down to who controls city government. It will come down to who controls Annapolis. Real police reform will come because you start changing who's got power, how wealth is distributed, and there's, it's not going to happen all in one go. But if people don't get organized to deal with power at the level of the city, the level of the state, and, some way federally too, but the city is the one that has the most power over the policing.
True.
If people don't take control of the city government, then we can keep talking about consent decrees. In real life, you'll have a nice classroom, and they're going to teach all about racial sensitivity and understanding racism, and they'll learn all the verbiage. Except when they get out in the car, they're going to do the same stuff they always do. Because the mission hasn't changed. Contain the crime in poor neighborhoods.
Right.
And if you have a city government and a state that says we're not going to tell cops to do anything about the war on drugs anymore. In fact, quite the contrary. We're going to start pushing for legalization, and we're take that off the table, the war on drugs. I mean, that would be the fastest way to alleviate this. You can't do that unless you have control of government, and people are understandably given up and are cynical about the possibility of having government actually play that role. And it's partly because the Democratic Party's in control here, and it's not, it's easier to fight the Republicans in some way, but because it's a black city council and it's Democrat, it's not a straightforward confrontation.
Right.
But there needs to be a takeover of popular people's forces in this town. And then you start telling the police what to do. And then you start doing what Easy says, fire the bloody people who don't want to go along with a change of culture. But you got to deal with the political side of this.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you so much for being part of this discussion here today. And I want to thank you for joining me at The Real Baltimore.